All right, here we are, Generous Theology. Chuck is here with Brock, and we are both excited. We're excited to have a chance to be taking a look at an interesting chapter. And I think one of the things that makes it so interesting is that people often have intuitive ideas about the topic. So we're in chapter 26. It's an essay on the topic of history, and it's by Professor Rebecca Lyman. And what are we to make of this thing called the past? And how are we, people who take the events from the past and bring them into the future, how are we to construct a history? And on what terms? What are the goals that we want to move towards? What are the pitfalls that we want to avoid? And what are all the issues involved? And I think I liked and enjoyed the essay in terms of addressing, I think, most of those topics. Now, I don't know that I agree with the professor with everything that she brought up, but I at least respect the fact that there was a clarity of the big picture here in thinking about history. And Chuck, just leading off, starting it off from your end, what were your thoughts on the chapter as a whole, as an overall, as you were working through it?
Yeah, as I read this chapter, it's interesting because what we've been doing is thinking about types of theological studies, right? Biblical studies and moral theology, and we talked about the various ways that we come to know about God and about God's will, experience, and scripture, and reason, worship, those kinds of things. And so now we come to this chapter on history. And of course, history is in and of itself a much broader topic than theology, but of course, it also has a huge impact on it because right in Scripture we have historical books, right? And there is a great deal of history contained in Scripture. But it also means that a lot of discussions about history and historiography, those kinds of questions often end up being applied to theology, to our reading of Scripture, and so there is a lot there to be thought about. The other interesting thing for me is, of course, well, I took a number of history classes in college. I was not a history major. I ended up being an English major, but my daughter was a history major along with her education degree. And one of my best friends as well is a history professor. In fact, my daughter had my friend as a history professor. And it's interesting because I know that there have been even at Christian colleges like Dordt University, where my daughter attended, and I did too, and my friend is a professor there. There's a lot of discussion about what is the nature of history, how do we study it, what is historiography, and how do we go about that task of thinking about history and writing about history and learning what really are the important topics in history. And those are ongoing, and I think they've been questions as well that have impacted a great deal a lot of how a lot of Christian writers, Christian historians approach their topics. And very often choices one makes can impact where you go with a particular issue. As I think I mentioned several times in the past few weeks, there's that saying that where you start your story often determines where you end it. And similarly, I think when you talk about history, where do you start your discussion of history? And that might be in time, where do you start your discussion of history of a particular topic? But it can also mean, where do you start it in terms of what are the assumptions that you make? What are the things that you consider to be important about the study of history? Those all have an impact on the story you end up telling. And as a result, people often tell very different stories about history. And often when those stories being told are very different, there is a tendency for people to get defensive and say, no, my version of history's got to be right. Yours must be wrong. Not always. And by the way, I don't think that always has to be the case, because I'm not one of these postmodernists who say, well, there's your truth and my truth and everybody else's truth. And so there's many, many different versions of truth. No, but I think there are different things that might get stressed and different issues that may be important depending on how you tell a historical story. If you're telling the story, just the story of America, do you start with, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue? That might that sort of a starting point is going to give you a particular context, and there are going to be issues that are going to be important as part of that context, like things like what was the role of the conquistadors? What was the role of the various folks who came from various different countries? What was the role of, for example, even to get into the religious area, what was the role of the drive for religious freedom? Those kind of issues, which I think traditionally we've thought of in doing American history. But what if your starting point is different? What if your starting point is you've got these various native tribes that are doing various things in certain years, and then here comes, in the midst of all that, here comes this new, some might say invasion, but this new immigration of people from elsewhere that disrupts that. That's going to tell a different story. Now, I don't think that means one or the other story is wrong. What it means is that you're telling different pieces of the story. And ideally, I think a good historian is able to gather those pieces together and have a larger understanding of it. But then oftentimes you're still going to apply those things to a smaller piece. So if as a historian your goal is to talk about a particular issue in some small town in Connecticut, or you're going to tell the lives of Cotton Mather or something like that, well, you're probably going to focus more on some of those histories that started in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and you're going to need to have some of that European context. Whereas if you're telling the story of, well, why is it that you have a certain the effigy mounds in the Midwest, and what did the effigy mounds, what did the discovery of these mounds mean even in the 19th century, and why there are some interesting stories about how settlers who had no idea what these effigy mounds were, what the stories they turned them into, and there you might need to have some of that native context, but you may also, because of the settlers and what they're doing with it, you're going to have some of that settler context as well, and so it's a really interesting thing. And that is just that factor is just doubled or tripled or more when you get into the history of theology and the history of religion and how history impacts how we do those things, because you've now thrown into the mix another piece, which is the fact that even as we do history, we do so with certain existing notions about things that we're studying the history of, right? So if we believe, as you and I do, that Scripture is something very different than most other human writings because it is also a record of God's message to us, it is God's revelation to us, even if humans were the way that God worked through to provide that message, that changes a little bit. What do we do with those particular writings? We're going to have to understand that context very differently. So yeah, it's just to me, it was a fascinating chapter, and we'll get into even more of this, but even some of the changes then as we move from earlier history and the way the Greeks and the early Christians practiced history to later, the 19th century, and people like Nietzsche, and the impact that has today as well. It just really was a fascinating chapter to read.
Thank you, my friend. Now, some first thoughts that I have that I want to throw out as a thesis is, so first of all, the challenge of modernity. So as we've moved from the medieval times, which is called by some historians the age of faith, and as we've moved from that time into a modern period, and now perhaps even a postmodern period, I think we can generally call this shift largely related to the period of the Enlightenment and the principles that defined that period. What we see over and over again from the moderns, the attack from the moderns, we see two major thrusts. We see an attack against the traditional dogmas, traditional religious dogmas, and then we see an attack against the Christian tradition of history insofar as it is at times hagiographic and uncritical. Now, in some sense, the existence of this Oxford Handbook could be seen in one of two lights. It could be seen as a capitulation. So the moderns pushed back, and Herman Bavinck spoke about their desire to create a dogma-less theology. And Bavinck was very critical that that could even be done. And in some sense, maybe the existence of this work demonstrates that. But there could be something else happening. And that is, it's not so much an objection to dogma per se, but as Bavinck notes, it's just an objection to what specifically is dogmatic. And so think here of regime change. Think here of a fire sale of the old Christian ideas, exchanging them for things that are roughly analogous in this new modern period. And I wonder if we are seeing the emergence of what could be called a rabbinical Christianity. What could that possibly mean? Well, we can see from history of the Jewish people that in the post-exile period, the scriptures, as important as they were and still remained for some in Judaism, the scriptures really lost their rule, their dominion. And so we had the emergence of new documents and a new form of Judaism called rabbinical Judaism. And so by the time of Christ, when we have Christ living and moving and acting in the first century Judea, we have this rabbinical Judaism being the religion that ostensibly is the same Judaism of King David, of Abraham, of Noah, and of Adam, moving back, this continuity with God. And yet, in practice, it's very difficult to see those as the same religion today. And so, too, we now have this situation in history with the large swing toward anti-hagiography and with the large swing toward, quote unquote, critical science. I think we have to postulate if what we're seeing with handbooks like this is the emergence of a rabbinical form of Christianity, something that in certain senses is unapologetically post-biblical, is unapologetically anti-hagiographic in the way that the Christian writings of the Middle Ages and early modern period were often hagiographic, and also pro-critical and against what they perceived as a lack of critical engagement on the part of the traditional Christian religion that let's just throw it out there, they actively are seeking to replace. This could be a stretch. This could be an arguable point. But Chuck, I was talking with somebody yesterday on social media, and there was an interaction there that I've had before, but I've never really had a chance to maybe put it all the pieces together and connect all the dots. A person submitted a 3 to 5 paragraph theological thesis. And so they wanted to go through and they wanted to speak about a particular doctrinal point. But one of the issues, one of the preconditions that they said right at the beginning was, I would love your thoughts here, but I don't want any engagement with church history. And so I started pushing on the person. Why? What has happened that the traditional church history can be written off so lightly, can be said to be out of bounds? Now, at the end of the day, there's this idea that you can have your answer. In some sense, the old church history is pushed aside so that something can replace it. I think I've also shared here that I took a seminary class on interpretation and hermeneutics. And this was a Christian seminary, a very evangelical seminary, actually. And one of the requirements was you have to choose a commentary that's going to be your core commentary on the scripture. And they explained this is about building a library, professional reference library. You're training here to go and be a minister. And as a minister, you need to have a good, solid library filled with professional quality works. Well, Chuck, you and I are down with that. But here was an interesting stipulation. The commentary could not have been written more than 50 years ago. And on top of that, they called one commentary out by name. You can not use Matthew Henry's commentary on the Bible. And I thought to myself, why? Now, I don't want to say that I couldn't think of some potential pedagogical reason. And I don't want to say that there couldn't be some difficulties. I get this idea that people can be alienated from the writings of the past and find them an extra level of difficulty. So, for example, that's why I read often read newer translations of the scriptures because very oftentimes the newer translations can have a freshness and immediacy to them because the language is much closer to the way you and I might talk and speak today. I get that. But at the same point in time, without seeking to be all conspiratorial toward it, this is really concerning, Chuck. And these kinds of interactions where, hey, I have this new systematic theology for you. Hey, let's take a new look at history. Hey, let's have a new perspective on Paul. Hey, let's have a new engagement with the doctrine of sin, with the doctrine of hell. Let's have a new engagement on what it means to be married. Hey, let's have some new ideas on what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. At some point, this starts to look, well, without saying it explicitly, it starts to look less than wholesome. And I don't mean to be conspiratorial with it. I do want to generally and charitably assess what these writers are saying and the essays that they're writing. And yet, it seems to be staring me in the face, Chuck. And I'm not sure where to push or go with that in the conversation here. What comes out in your thinking and what strikes you and where do we build?
Yeah, it is interesting that certainly there is, I think, a move away from certain more traditional, older ways of, especially as we talk about doing history, but other things as well. There does tend to always be this myth of progress. I'm not sure that we've had that in all of history, but certainly in recent years, in recent centuries, there's been this myth of progress, this idea that we are always moving forward and that forward direction is also an improvement. That's what I mean by the myth of progress. And that's not to say that there aren't certain things that are better today than they were in the past, right? Certainly we don't lose 70% of our children in the first year to preventable diseases. Happened in the past because in those days those diseases weren't preventable, and there's a lot of negative things in the past that we don't have anymore. So there's been progress, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're in this natural direction of progress, and it doesn't mean that progress is guaranteed to us. So that's one thing. And I think that myth of progress I think that myth of progress is very common. And even among many Christians, even among all sorts of, even people who might consider themselves conservative in certain ways, and conservative in the traditional meaning just means that they want to preserve older ways, more traditional ways of doing things. But even people who consider themselves conservative, oftentimes that myth of progress seems to have impacted the way that we think. So, and that is something I think we have to recognize in ourselves. The flip side to that, of course, is that there is that famous Reformation slogan, Semper Reformanda, right? Always reforming. And there is a sense in which, even though we cannot buy into the myth of progress, there is also a sense that the role of the Christian is always to be moving in the proper direction, in the right, and that direction is towards God, to be doing the things of God, to be acting out His will, to more fully understand of God. And so there is a sense in which, as Christians, we also do have, even if we don't buy into this sort of myth of progress, there is a sense in which we do have a role of always moving forward, of always reforming. Now, I think those are two different things. I think the myth of progress is this idea that it's automatic. No matter what, new is always better. And that in television commercials, that in all sorts of things, new is always better. Well, Semper Reformanda isn't about new is always better. It's about striving towards a better that is based on a timeless truth, which is the glory of God. And so when we are Semper Reformanda, when we are always reforming, we're doing so not simply because we think the future is always going to be better than the past, but because we're striving to a particular future that more really represents God's will. There's a part of that then that also means that as Christians who have timeless truths that we believe in, who do believe that there are those broad shoulders that we're standing on, that we're not going to kick the knees out from under, even as we strive to move forward. It does mean that we do have some level of responsibility when we reach out to the world around us, when we evangelize, shall we say, and by that more than just simply try to make people Christians, but I think it's also about publicly living the Christian life in society and looking to transform our communities and our societies in ways that God's will. There is a sense in which we do have to at least contextualize what we know. Now, that doesn't mean we change the truths. What it means is that we apply those truths in ways that are winsome and understandable to the particular culture. And so that's why I think today, if you go to a mission college, a lot of what gets talked about is how do you contextualize the truths, the absolute truths of the gospel, but do so in a way that makes sense to a particular culture. I remember as a kid watching a movie, and I think I saw this movie several times. It was put out by Global Missions, which back in the days was just called Christian Reformed World Missions, which was our denomination's global missions organization. And the movie was about missionaries who had gone to Papua New Guinea. And in Papua New Guinea, there are hundreds and hundreds of languages, hundreds and hundreds of cultures. You could be on one side of a river and another side of the river, and you've got very different languages, very different cultures. And so one of the things they talked about in this movie was how it was the job of these missionaries and Bible translators who were going into these relatively remote communities on the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea to begin to understand the cultures that they were engaging with, and to translate the scriptures in a way that made sense. And so in this movie, they talk about how among the Sepik Iwam people, which is a small group, a small ethnicity that lives along the Sepik River in Papua New Guinea, the concept of that for us is the concept of the heart, right? The heart being at the center of who we are, the heart being, if you change a person's heart, you change their whole life, right? Well, in the Sepik Iwam culture, it's the stomach and not the heart. To them, the stomach is that central core of who you are. It represents everything about you relates to your stomach. And so in the film, they pointed out that the Bible translators who were trying to translate the Bible into the Sepik Iwam language had lengthy conversations about what should we use. Do we continue to use the Sepik Iwam word for heart, where in English and in Latin and in Hebrew the word heart is used, or do we go with the word stomach? And interestingly, and they did this at a level that could be understood by kids, but they had this discussion. On the one hand, the Bible does say heart, and there's probably a reason that it does say heart, and there is something to that. On the other hand, that it would make no sense to the Sepik Iwam people. It would be in some ways nonsensical, but they don't even talk about the heart. The heart is just this thing. It has a particular function, but that's about it. It's not the center of the core being. And so they actually in the film showed these missionaries discussing back and forth, and then bringing in people from that culture and talking to them about the concepts that they were going through. And usually what they'll do is they'll work with one or two people from that culture who are Christians. Oftentimes it's people who had moved away from their tribe and moved into the city, but still had connections. They became Christians maybe in Port Moresby or in one of the other cities, but they still had these connections back. And so they would go back with these missionaries and those kind of discussions about what do we do? And in the end, in the film, they chose to use the word stomach, and where we often use the word heart, and Mary pondered these things in her heart, for example, in Luke 2, verse 20. In the Sepik Iwam language, Mary ponders these things in her stomach. And it's very interesting, and it gets it to this point that we do still have to contextualize, but do we contextualize solely for the idea of, well, this is new, or do we do it because what we're trying to do is give timeless truths in ways that make sense to a particular culture? And I think that's an important piece, and that's why I really appreciated what Professor Lyman did here, at least in the historical section, in just describing how some of those changes came about. She talks about how Jewish concepts of history are often contrasted with those of Greece and Rome, but that there are some similarities. what happens then under Augustine and historical ways of thinking under Augustine, and then what happens when in the 19th century the professional study of history becomes wedded to empirical methods of science. What happens then later? You have sort of the neo-orthodox criticism of that, and then you move in even into the latter half of the 20th century, where developments in historiography have changed even further, and there are a lot of other types of discussions that are happening. And later she talks about the hermeneutic of suspicion and those kinds of things. I do think that at the very least her discussion of that change through history was very useful in helping us to think about how do we contextualize the timeless truths. Obviously, when we do that, we can't lose that there's two sides to this, right? There is the contextualization, that's important, but we can also never forget that what we are contextualizing, what we are bringing to the people in our particular contexts of our cultures and our particular times in history, we're still bringing something that is set, that is solid, that is timeless, those truths of Scripture. So that's, yeah, it was really helpful to walk through that path of that historical path of how through history did we think about history, and Professor Lyman I thought was helpful in that regard.
Thank you for that, Chuck. I am reminded that, let me see if I can put it this way, that history is not a victimless crime. Let's see if I can put that out there. And what do I mean by that? Well, there was this video I was watching, and it was titled, "When Did the Roman Think Rome Fell?" Now, we have some fairly standard answers in history regarding that question. There's a very typical narrative around 475 AD with Odoacer coming in, and by his military conquest, he deposed the last of the Romans, and the Roman Empire in the West was in some sense no more. But interestingly enough, this video essay points out that if that particular time was the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, well, in an awkward sense, someone didn't tell many of the Romans. For we have evidence now that many Romans saw what had happened as a bump in the road, to be sure, but not the ending of the Roman Empire per se. And so it's really only with the movement of Justinian that you start to see this narrative emerge, that 475 was the time when that happened. And so now we're really left in an interesting situation, because who's right? And it would be awfully awkward if we, in the 21st century, took a look at the Romans who lived in that 5th century time and tell them, no, you don't know. You don't understand. Your empire fell in 475. And you can imagine them saying back, well, that's not when I think it fell. Who are you to say otherwise? And so I can really see that being a part of the challenge of history. And so we could even find ourselves in situations where we have these battles over authenticity. What does it mean? Who's really a Roman? And with all the similar situations there, we can see this occurring in the quote unquote battle for Christianity. Who quote unquote owns the Christian goods? Who's the one who should speak on behalf of the religion? And if a large number of people say, well, to be a real Christian is this, when it's a brand new thing for so many of the others, well, the points of conflict are obvious. And Chuck, I don't think we have easy answers here. And I think one of the things that the professor points out is that history really does have to be across cultures. In other words, the Greeks and Romans don't have a monopoly on history, and neither do the Jews, and neither do the Hellenic Christians, and neither do any one particular group of people, but in some sense, history, it applies to us all. And I think I appreciated that. I'm so impressed, though, Chuck, with this idea that we can construct a history. One of the points that Professor Lyman points out there is that control over the editorial process is a big deal. And that means that whoever writes the history, whoever selects the dates, in some sense, really has a lot to say. about what is quote unquote true in the Christian world. And so who can fully escape that? I don't know that there's an easy answer there, but it's at least worth noting the issue. And I think the professor does that. When you think about those kinds of controversy, Chuck, are these largely academic in your mind, or do you feel like there's much more at stake here?
Well, there is an academic character to some of these controversies. I think very clearly they are not merely academic. I think we can even see in some of the different ways that we talk about issues here in the 21st century, we can see the effects of these historical controversies and historiographical controversies in the way that we talk about things. And there is a sense in which at times it almost feels like we talk different languages when we talk about history. Just again, to talk about American history, for example, there are those who very much take a particular view that of America being a Christian nation and being founded on Christian values. And so they talk about certain of the founding fathers in particular ways. There are others who really challenge that and look at other issues, and therefore that also colors how they see certain things. And it does seem at times that while there are plenty of others who I think understand some of the different directions and understand why there are certain interpretations of history and understand that there are some differences between various founding fathers, for example. But it does seem that sort of in the general culture, we almost have become unable to communicate because we've gotten so tied into particular traditions as far as history and particular interpretations of that. I'm also seeing, for example, and this is interesting because it builds on something very early in Professor Lyman's chapter, but I'm seeing a lot more discussion not in academic historical contexts, but just in general, just regular people talking about what is history? Is history linear? Is it always the building up of one thing upon another and this linear story that moves in a particular direction? Or is history more circular? Is it something that tends to repeat itself or go in particular cycles? Professor Lyman pointed out that there is a sense that Jewish concepts of history often were thought of as more cyclical. Greek and Roman traditions seem to be more linear. And yet she points out that realistically that's not true, that there is some level of aspects of cyclical time and aspects of linear time in both the Jewish ways of thinking and Greek and Roman ways of thinking. Well, today, I think we're also seeing that same kind of discussion. And I think it may also be a reflection of growing influence of other cultures, right? So in Hindu and Buddhist ways of thinking, history is much more circular. It is much more cyclical. Obviously, those who believe in a form of you come back in another form, in another life, that's certainly a very cyclical way of thinking. And I think those concepts are beginning to make their way into sort of the common culture and the common vernacular, even just ideas of karma, right? And the way people talk about it today in ways that they didn't probably didn't 50 years ago is a reflection of some changes in that and some ideas of the cyclical nature of history. Now, one of the reasons I bring that one up is because it's certainly, first of all, whether we see history as primarily linear or as primarily cyclical makes a difference in what kinds of actions we'll take. If we see history as primarily cyclical, we're going to try to figure out where we're on the cycle, and we're going to try to figure out where we need to go and how do we mitigate certain of the problems of being at certain places on the cycle and how we can benefit from being on that part of the cycle. But there is perhaps less of an impetus to make large changes in a cyclical way of thinking. In a linear way of thinking, the thought is you're moving in a particular direction, and the person, the actor in history, must always be pushing towards one direction or another. And so then there is a thought that we can have a huge impact if we just do the right things. We'll go in that particular cycle, and that's been more of a Western way of thinking, but it's impacted all sorts of, frankly, Marxism is an example of that, right? Marxism is this idea that there is a destiny, there's an arc to history that is inevitable in a particular direction. I'm reading, it's a novel, but it does a nice job of expressing in post-war Germany and in post-war Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia is where the action seems to be mostly taking place. And it is in immediately after World War II in these Soviet-controlled sectors, but before the Soviets have entirely imposed their Russian version, their Stalinism on these countries. And so you have these discussions happening among communists, they're all communists that are in power at this point, but there's various different views. And you've got the Yugoslavs who say, no, we're going to, and as we know in history, to some extent they were successful with, we're gonna be somewhat different from you Russians. You Russians have a particular way of thinking. We think that's not quite right, and we're going to go in these other directions. And in Germany, certainly there was early on, it ended up being repressed fairly heavily by the Russians, but there was a move to have German-centered communism rather than Russian-centered communism. And similarly, and it's interesting to hear a character in the book who is also a real person historically, who is a Czech communist who ends up eventually being murdered by the Soviets because they didn't like his particular Czech brand of socialism and communism. He made some kind of comment about, well, us Czechs, we're far more industrialized, we're far more cultured than those Russians. So obviously we're going to do things differently than those uncultured Russians. And of course that him saying that publicly got him into all sorts of trouble with the Soviet occupiers. But it's interesting to see that even in Marxism, in a lot of capitalist ways of thinking, the one thing that's common is this linear way of thinking. And even strictly linear ways of thinking can lead us to think in certain ways. I think when we think about theology now, there are very key historical issues in theology. One that Professor Lyman doesn't talk about at all. I don't know much about her background, and it may be that this is just not an issue among her sort of fellow traditions or the people of her religious tradition. But I think of the very large difference between Christians who look at history as being a series of dispensations that are unrelated to each other. New dispensations, the dispensation of the church there was the dispensation of Israel, and I don't know all the language behind that, since that's not my particular tradition, but that is a very different way of thinking than sort of a more, I think, linear way that a lot of Reformed folks will think, that there is a continuity to history, that we haven't moved from one particular dispensation where the rules are such to a new dispensation where the rules are such, but rather something more continuous. And that has a huge impact on our theology. If one accepts one or the other of those ways of thinking about history and of theological ways of thinking about history, it's going to have a huge impact on your theology. And so these are important things to think about, and a lot of these issues of cycles and directions and linear ways of thinking it's just there's so much there, and I feel like you can almost get caught up in the weeds in a lot of this stuff, but it's super interesting and I think very worthwhile to think about and apply to how we do our theology.
Thank you, my friend. Now, there was one other interesting point fairly early in the chapter relating to these issues. And so we talked about the video that I had seen recently about what did the Romans think when Rome fell, and how the answer from historians today would likely not be a great fit for the answer of several of the people groups actually involved in the process. And Professor Lyman in this essay brings up another example of this by contrasting two different thinkers, Eusebius of Caesarea and Augustine of Hippo. Now, in Eusebius's mind, we have the history of Christianity in the West, within Roman society, as this culmination, as this correction of the many streams of Mediterranean culture which came before it, and in particular, the transformation of Hellenism into Christianity. And so Eusebius is writing in a time in which Christianity had made the transition from being persecuted within the Roman Empire to a period when it was accepted, and very shortly after that, it was actually adopted as an official state religion and came to eclipse the other official state religions. And so the arc to writers like, for example, Eusebius, seems to have this very strong cultural tie-in. Christianity is rising as it ascends in the culture. And yet Augustine is writing about a century after Eusebius. And something else has happened, because while Christianity is going stronger than ever, it is in fact the Roman Empire which is falling. Now, Augustine lived before what we would consider today the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but he lived and wrote The City of God in response to the historical attack against the city of Rome that was successful. I believe it was 410 AD. And there were a lot of people who were thinking, wait a minute, we had just adopted this new religion, and this God, this Christian God, is supposed to protect us. And now, just within a few decades of adopting this new religion, all of a sudden our mighty empire, which has lasted 1,000 years, seems very shaky and seems falling apart. And is that, in fact, does that wear well for the truth of Christianity? And so Augustine writes The City of God in part to answer and address that. And I think the answer from Augustine is that Christianity is something larger than just today's political situation. And I think that's a word for people like myself who have an interest in politics in this contemporary age. Yes, be involved politically, but also remember that to some degree, the current nation is part of Christian history, but is not the totality of Christianity. And so you have this interesting historical situation, and a third narrative can come out of this, which is, so the first narrative was Eusebius, and it was a positive thing. Christianity and Rome are linked. Then 100 years later, we have Augustine writing, hey, Christianity's fortunes does not rise and fall with Rome per se. God has his own city. Rome is not that final thing that history is building towards. And then what we have in modernity is we have ideas that modern people do not even need God. As we have advanced, as we've become more sophisticated, as we've become more aware, as we've grown, as history has progressed, we're smarter, better looking. Our children have a higher percentage of body fat. That was a joke. But my point is this idea of progress has led many moderns to think that Christianity is something old and outdated and something to be discarded. Or if it's not to be discarded, it maybe needs to be reinvented for the modern person. And now we're back to the raison d'etre of some of these books, like these Oxford Handbooks, the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology, the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Studies, the Science of Moral Theology that we read about in just a previous chapter. And so what an interesting arc, Chuck. And I'm not proposing that we solve it here, but I think you can't read a chapter like this without being prompted to ask that question, and also to be struck by the idea of editorial control of the narrative. Who writes the narrative? Who writes the Christian narrative, what Christianity is? And if the Christian orthodoxy of 150, 200 years from now doesn't look anything like the Christian orthodoxy of today, what does that mean about you and I and our narrative understanding of the Christian faith? Chuck, this really brings up the challenges. Let me just throw it over to you for some final thoughts on how we might want to wrestle with some of those problems.
Yeah, I think, first of all, in wrestling with some of these problems, I certainly don't believe that in the way that many 19th century and even some 20th century theologians do, in this idea of historical criticism, and that by deconstructing what's in Scripture, by the logically rational, what do we know about true history, that's not. I don't think that's helpful. But what I will say about historical criticism is I do think that there is value to understanding various historical perspectives and then applying those historical perspectives as we look at Scripture, remembering, of course, that what the special character of Scripture, how it is different than other historical documents, but recognizing that there are, as we interpret the truths of Scripture, we are often impacted by our worldviews, and history can tell us a lot about those worldviews. In fact, as we go back, we often can tell much more about the worldviews of people before us than we can about our own because we're still so caught up in them. But having an understanding of history, having an understanding of historical ways of thinking may give us a leg up on understanding our own foibles, our own issues, our own sort of stumbling blocks to understanding the truths of Scripture. So I'm glad that we have chapters like this. I'm glad that we have the opportunity to study history and to apply the study of history even to such things as Scripture. As such, I'm glad, for example, that my kids, when they went to various Christian schools, two of them completely in the Reformed or evangelical tradition, and one also in the Lutheran tradition. But in all those schools, they were taught church history, because there is a sense in which we need to understand our history in order to understand what it is that we believe. And so I don't want to lose that. And I think there's some validity then to applying that history in ways that helps us to understand. You talked about the difference here between Eusebius and Augustine. Prior to reading this chapter, I knew a lot about Augustine. I knew very little about Eusebius. And I found that narrative of the difference between the two, only merely a century apart, to be really not only interesting, but potentially very useful in our times, right? Are we going to be more like Eusebius and see the world and a lot of what's happening as being a culmination of Christianity? Are we part of a larger? Is the Western world sort of a continuation of a kind of Christendom, or are we more like Augustine and seeing some things that are falling apart and maybe having a somewhat different view of the connection between Christian history and political history? I'm not saying that one or the other is necessarily right or wrong particularly, but having that knowledge, reading about these different characters and how they, in their own contexts, understood how history and theology, how history and the practice of religion, history and worship, how the connections between those in history, I think also helps us today in making conclusions about where are we and what are the things that we ought to be focusing on and what are the things that we may be missing and where are some areas where we ought to be focusing even more attention. We didn't get to it, but I know Professor Lyman later talks about some of the very more modern and postmodern issues that are being raised, and things like different types of ways of looking at history from various interest groups' perspectives and things like that. That's an area, I think, where while we may not want to buy into all of the particular worldviews of folks espousing and expressing certain historical views that go in a particular direction, I think there is some value in at least understanding it and paying attention to it and learning the context there, because there may be some things that we can learn from that as well. Yeah, there's so much here, Brock. This was again another chapter that, frankly, after I read it, just had my mind whirling for a while, because there's just so much there to chew on, and you need to take some time to digest as you read through it, and so being able to talk about it is just sort of like it's like the cow with seven stomachs. It's like just another opportunity to rechew that cud a little bit and think through it and maybe get something even more out of it. I hope that wasn't too unusual of an image, but yeah, it was a good opportunity.